There are so many techniques in quilting. I am always learning about new ones. And I just recently came across the technique of pinecone quilts. Today's guest, Betty Ford Smith, started making pinecone quilts in 2004 with help from her mentor, Miss Sue. Since then, she's been keeping this technique alive through research, teaching, and gallery showings. And now she has quilts at the National Quilt Museum, the International Quilt Museum, and in the Smithsonian. So you're going to want to watch this one. So grab your sewing and a cup of tea, and here's my interview with Betty Ford Smith. Welcome, Betty, to the show. Whereabouts in the world are you coming to us from?
I'm in Sebring, Florida, and that's in Central Florida. I always tell people, if you're looking at the map of Florida, there's a little hole there. It's just above the hole in the map, just above Okeechobee.
And are you originally from Florida?
No, I'm from New Rochelle, New York. I was born in New Rochelle, raised in Mount Vernon, went to school in New Rochelle. So I'm from Westchester County. New Rochelle, we call it Dick Van Dyke country for Rob Petrie, that kind of thing. Because I grew up watching that, and they always talked about New Rochelle or the Pelham train station and things like that. So that's how people recognize it.
So how did you end up in Florida?
Well, let's see. First of all, in New York, I don't like cold weather anymore. And I think it was 1977, I moved to St. Thomas first after a terrible snowstorm. I was living in Rhinebeck, New York, which is up near the Catskills. And we had a terrible snowstorm. I ran off the road, and I only twisted my wrist, but it was enough to say, I don't want to do this anymore. And I wrote to St. Thomas, and they said, oh, yes, come on down, teach school here. We'd love it. They give you a ticket back in those days, fly you in, and that was it. So then after 3 or 4 years of living in the Caribbean, my father passed away and my mom was alone. I decided to come back home, try to help out at home with her. And I have a brother that was living also at the time. So I came back to visit the family, but once again, I encountered snow and bad weather. I stayed for 3 more years. I said, okay, I'm moving to Florida. My father used to always tell us stories about wanting to retire to Florida, go fishing, just enjoy life in the sun. And so I remembered that and said, let me try Florida. He always talked about that. So I moved to Florida. But when I moved to Florida, I went to Dade County to Miami first. And it was interesting because I was teaching then. I went to the Board of Education to ask for a teaching position. And they said, oh, yes, we're going to send you to Homestead, Florida. That's way down, just before the Keys. So if you survive down in Homestead, then you'll stay in Florida. So I did. And here I am. Been almost 30 years.
Amazing. In this amazing book with this amazing quilt on the cover, you talk about meeting Miss Sue in 2004. Did you have any quilting history or crafting history before you met Miss Sue?
Not really. When I was a home economics teacher for a while, and I taught hearing impaired students home economics. So, and when I would teach, I taught emotionally disturbed criminal teenagers in upstate New York. When I did the sewing lessons, I always taught them how to hand sew because my mother had taught me how to hand sew first before using a sewing machine. I liked hand stitching. And then one day, a friend, I was doing an exhibit downtown Sebring, and a lady came up to me and said, Betty, I've got some interesting quilts you might like to see, because she knew I was artsy craftsy. She didn't know whether I liked quilts or not. We'd never spoken about quilts, but she just thought, you love art, you're going to love these. She pulled 2 amazing quilts out of the car that I had never seen. I went absolutely crazy and said, oh, I've got to learn how to make that. She didn't want to introduce me at first to Miss Sue. She wanted to keep her to herself. And I said, oh, I'd love to meet her and I'd love to learn how to make it. So finally, she took me over and introduced me to her. Now, Miss Sue was 92 when I met her. So when people are in their 90s, I think we're a little afraid of strangers. So she was a little apprehensive about, what does this lady really want? Does she want to really work with me? And I told her, I'd really love to learn how to make this quilt. Has anybody ever asked you before? And she said, no, no one had ever asked her. So there I was. She didn't live far from me. And in fact, she lived around the corner from the school board. So I was passing her house every day going to work and didn't even know that. And she had a little sign outside, which I show in the book. And I missed that sign. I'm so sorry I missed it. I could have learned from her a few years earlier. But it was funny because going to lessons in her house, she would sit in front of the fireplace And I might mention it's been cold this week. For us, it's cold when it's 55 and 60. So she had a fireplace going all the time. And when I go over there to sew, I'd come home, my head would be clogged, my nose would be running because of all the smoke and the fire and the heat, and sitting there sewing for 3 or 4 hours. But I endured and I loved every moment of it. Her fireplace was covered with that tacky paper that people put in the drawer to keep their silverware. She patchworked the fireplace with all these different designs. And I think I have a picture of that in the book as well. Yeah.
So you ended up doing a really deep dive into not only how to make a pine cone quilt, but the history of it. It must have been fairly challenging back in 2004 looking for things. How did you find it?
Was. It really was because, first of all, no one had ever heard of it before. I kept asking famous quilters and different people. No, they didn't know anything about it. So I really had to start trying to trace this triangle shape, folding fabric, that kind of idea. There was a quilting book I found, and
A Piece of My Soul, Quilts by Black, Arkansas.
yes, so that's where I found two pictures of this quilt. And I said, oh, all right, there it is. Then I went to some Florida quilt books and I found another picture of the quilt, just one. And as time went on, I kept asking Miss Sue, well, how did you learn about this quilt? But her grandmother taught her. So it was handed down to her. There wasn't anybody there. The artist, Alma Thomas, she did these circular motions with this design also. And I thought, wow, she must have been in the same area. So I started piecing it together that people in Georgia, top end of Florida, that area were making these quilts. And of course, Alabama G's Bin quilters were making this quilt also. Now, a lot of people made it just in squares, the blocks, maybe a block this size, and you make 12 or 20 of these, and then you sew them all together, and you get a beautiful quilt like that as well. This one behind me. There. See, those are all pieced together. And that one is done polyester, this quilt that I'm sitting on, and it's one of the vintage quilts. And then there's different ways to fold it also. I found out you could make it pointier. North Carolina, the Lumbee tribe, there was a woman there that made their first pine cone, and they call them sometimes pine burr or pine cone. Miss Sue called it a cuckleburl quilt, like the cuckleburls, the pine cones that fall off the tree, but people also call them cuckleburls. I've seen it called a target quilt, pineapple quilt. So you had to look up all these different names to start finding it. And I really had more information, but I was running out of time in writing my book. So I couldn't put in all the research that I was finding at that time. People always want the instructions. They want to see pictures and they want the instructions. So I had to spend a lot of time how to get this quilt together so I could teach somebody to follow it step by step.
So have you found out whether this is a technique that the enslaved brought with them from Africa, or was it a Native American technique that was modified for the fabrics that were available?
I'm thinking it was more of a, maybe the slaves did bring some of the design element, but they didn't need quilts because it's just so hot there. But the Native Americans doing all their hand stitching might have seen this design because it's the triangle that really gets you. Here's a vintage piece. Look at how tiny that one is. And the Native Americans do very small, fine handwork and beadwork and these natural colors. And the one that's in the museum in North Carolina is beige and shades of brown. So there weren't vivid colors like we're using today. So yes, I think the folding of fabrics made that easy. And then it's also called prairie points. So the women traveling
That's what I
across
learned
the
it as.
country took these little points too, and they embellished aprons with them, the edges of their hats, their shoulders on their dresses, things like that. So yes, that triangle, that little square went around so many places. Starts in the center with 4 pieces, and you just keep going around.
So
And
there's a lot of fabric that you don't see in the quilt.
oh, yes, there's a lot. I found it best to use fabrics that have a lot of design on them. So it's really pretty like that and it kind of blends together. And then you can throw in a solid color every now and then to really make it pop. This is the block that I made for the National Quilt Museum when I did the block of the month. So
Wow.
Now, if I go a little closer, can you see some of the designs? There's some cherries in there, and the blue
Yeah.
has like a paisley design, and there's some orange. But each one of the fabrics have a design on them. If the green one has a very light one, that light green one, so you can hardly see that. That's how it
So
looks.
you've mentioned the International Quilt Museum. Did they
Yes.
come to you or did you go to them?
Okay, so what happened while I was doing my research and trying to find out people that have seen this quilt, I thought, let me try the National Quilt Museum. I looked at their website and they had hundreds of quilts, so they must know something about this. So I sent it to the curator there, a picture of my quilts, and she wrote back, wow, I've never seen anything like that. Would you like to do a show and talk about these quilts? I was so excited to have that opportunity. So there I was in 2019, we went there. So that was great.
So
And they
can
had,
you give us just a brief outline of how you actually make the pine cone quilt? Like what size of square are you using?
I'm not making a square. If I did a block, that's a 12-inch block. When I do a little workshop, I'll do a 12-inch block. And the base is a sheet, a worn out sheet, or you can use just some muslin fabric. If I can see my hand through it, I think it's thin enough to get that needle through because it's a 3-inch needle that Miss Sue always used. And
Yeah, that's quite a long one.
yes, this is actually 3.5 inches. But some of the people I've taught, they use a smaller needle. I find it easier to use this big needle just the way I was taught. And then she probably had to use what was available back then. So that's the other thing. We use crochet thread. It's nice and stiff to make a quilt. Now you can do something small and just use regular fabric. But if you want it to last 100 years, you want to use some thread that's really not going to pop. In fact, I recently was working on one and the sheet turned out to be too thin. It was so worn that
Right.
in the creases, it started ripping all by itself. So I had to sew it back together. And some of the ones I have found, some of my vintage pieces, I see where they had to sew their base sheet back together in places because it would rip on them. But once you get all the pieces on, it holds. And you could also put a backing on it so that you don't have the thread showing on the back. Because I made one for a baby, for a baby's crib, and she loved turning it over and playing with the stitches on the back. So we found out it was better to just cover those stitches when the child's going to play with it.
Okay, so you take squares of fabric and you fold them into four?
Yes. So I start with a 5 by 5 square piece of fabric. Usually when I'm making them, let's see, I cut up 3 yards of fabric at a time, and that'll take me around a whole row once I'm making a large quilt. And I fold them one at a time. So I might have my little stack of 5 by 5s already. I don't press them. I just finger press. And ladies that love to quilt always want to press. So they come to my workshops with their little bags of colors, all pressed and folded and ready to go. They're so perfect. And it does make for a lovely design, but I'm trying to keep the tradition and the old fashioned way. So you just finger press it like that. And you get this big piece. Now, there's another type where you fold it again and you get a thinner,
Okay,
you get a more
so that's
pointy.
an extra fold.
Yes, that's an extra fold. So you can do that way, or you can also take this triangle and turn it in and in like this, and you still get a different point.
Get a different one. Okay.
So there are different folding techniques, and that goes back to origami, right? And the Japanese folding method. Well, the Japanese and the Chinese also use this method in embellishing some of their clothing outfits. And I found some beautiful pieces, but they do it usually in this very tiny method like this.
Right.
This is probably a 1-inch square. And you really have to be nimble with your fingers. And Russian women also make this design.
So as you lay down, is it four, and then you just do circles around it from there?
Mhm.
Is there a particular number of triangles that you put in, or are you just eyeballing it?
No, you're just eyeballing it. I
And
mean, you
then
start with
you,
4.
you
They each overlap though, so that when you're overlapping, it just grows. Like if you're drawing a circle starting in the center, it just starts growing. And if it starts getting too tight and bunches up, then you add a triangle, and that keeps stretching it making it bigger.
So you're using cotton or crochet yarn,
Yeah,
uh,
number 10, a
number
number 10.
10.
Mhm. That's the
And
one
then what size of needle are you using?
3.5 inch.
3.5 inch, but what diameter of the needle? Is
Oh,
it
that I don't know. That's a good question. No, I just,
that being that long, are those considered doll making needles or
yes, they are called doll making needles.
okay,
Well, frequently they're called doll making needles, but some of them are a little bit thicker and some are a little thinner. But you have to see what goes through your fabric. I would say a problem sometimes, your hands get sore because some fabrics are thicker than others. And especially quilting fabrics. If you're in a quilt store and you're buying those wonderful fabrics there, they have a thickness to them. And then there's some other fabrics you can buy in a less expensive fabrics, and the needle goes right through very easily.
right.
You have to
I
decide.
noticed you have some batiks in yours. How did you find working with batik?
Oh, I have to stay away from batiks. I love them. They're beautiful colors, but every now and then I'll say, okay, I'll throw one in, but it is so hard on my thumb that it gets sensitive after a while. Sometimes I have to put a Band-Aid on my thumb and my pointer finger just to push through because I don't use thimbles.
So you're just making concentric circles, just getting them bigger and bigger as you go out.
And I'm sitting with it in my lap, by the way. I found, well, that's the way Miss Sue taught me also, is sitting with it in my lap of my first, well, this is the one that I was showing you that I have a bag for. So that's on the first page. But Miss Sue and I, in our first lesson, it was so funny. She pulled out an entire sheet. So when I first started teaching, now this is the quilt that I made with her, the very first quilt. When I first started teaching, it was only 2 or 3 people who came over to visit me and they said they wanted to learn. I gave them each a full size sheet to start on. And that's a lot to work with when you're just learning to make it. So that's why I laughed so much because she gave it to me that way. So I started doing it like that. And then I finally, as a teacher, realized that's too much for my students. I cut it down to 12 inches to just a block size and let them manage that. So I've had maybe in 20 years now, 3 women show me their finished product that they made. One made a queen size, and one lady made a king size, and somebody else did a full size. And they did very well.
Now these quilts must be really heavy.
Yeah. My first one, I was shocked, weighed 18 to 19 pounds. Then they started going up to 20, 25 pounds. And the one I recently made that's purple and red, that turned out to be 50 pounds. And I couldn't figure out why it was 50 pounds. None of my other king size quilts were 50 pounds. And then I realized it was the weight of the fabric that I was using. It was so heavy, we had to wheel it out in a wheelbarrow to spread it out on the lawn to photograph it. We couldn't even lift it.
So do you sleep under these quilts?
No. We tried one day. We didn't try to sleep, but we did lay it on the bed and got under the quilt. You're just there. You're just straight. You can't turn over or anything like that. So it's great if you want to confine somebody to the bed.
So
And if
you use,
you're in the really cold, cold neck of the woods, this certainly will keep you warm. Here's a picture that's
yeah,
with Sue and I with my first lesson. So yes, in the book it has several little pictures, but I had taken a lot of the pictures with my camera, and because it was my camera, they weren't photo ready for books, to be published. So those pictures, a lot of them we couldn't use, but I use them in my slide presentations. And when somebody does call me from time to time to do a lecture or a trunk show at home, I'll do that for them. So they get to see a lot of the pictures that I couldn't put in the book.
right.
So yes, I do it in my lap. I sit on my sofa at home with my legs up on the sofa bench with my legs straight out. She sat in a rocking chair to make it. When I sit in the chair and just let the fabric hit the floor, I find that I'm pulling a lot. And because of the way, especially as it gets larger, that's a lot in my lap. So it's easier for me to just put my legs underneath the quilt and just keep spinning it. And sometimes it gets so heavy, I have to ask my husband to, can you get out of your chair and help me spin this a little bit? Because I want to turn it a little more, that kind of thing. Yeah. And my doctor told me I'm getting too old to be carrying these heavy quilts around the house because sometimes he's watching something on TV that I don't want to watch and I want to leave the living room. I pick up this heavy quilt and take it to the bedroom, and I lay on the bed, and I'm sewing in the bed, right? So it's too far to be carrying them around in the house now, so I've stopped doing that. But I always laughing that she was 98 years old and still making these quilts, and I'm so impressed with the way this woman lived, living by herself,
Mm.
making quilts, cooking for herself, doing her own laundry, gardening. And I want to live like that. I hope that I could live to be 90 years old. But I'm not following a strict diet, her kind of diet, things that she ate. She didn't sew every day. So I try not to sew for as long a periods of time. Like I would sew 10 hours a day. She would get up in the morning, make herself some breakfast, and be sewing about 9 o'clock. But by 2 o'clock, she had stopped and she would start watching her shows on TV, The Price is Right, and some game shows and things like that. But I was furious. I was going at 10 hours a day every day, and I wore myself out for a while there. So I have to do it in moderation now.
So did you have a purpose for that first quilt that you made?
Yes, my purpose was to beat Miss Sue at it. I wanted to. She challenged me. She said, "I don't think you're going to finish this." So when we started, I think it was like November, and I was finished by February. And of course, she finished hers a little before me. But still, I did it, and I wasn't sure I could finish it. And I had never finished a quilt before this time. I had started one or two quilts on the sewing machine and never finished anything. So I was so proud of myself. And then I turned around and made a second one while she was still alive without her close supervision, like spending more time at home. Because the first one, I was spending more time with her and she's watching me step by step. But the second quilt I made, the lady that I had taken some formal quilting lessons with before I met Miss Sue, encouraged me to put this quilt in the fair down in Lake Placid, our Highlands County Fair. And I said, well, I don't know. And she said, oh, try it. So I went down there to put this quilt in the fair, and the ladies told me it wasn't a quilt and it couldn't be in there because it didn't have the three traditional layers, the top, the middle, and the bottom. I said, yes, but it's folded. You know, you have all this weight. You do have a top. You don't necessarily have this middle, but you do have the bottom. So a lady that was in charge, she came by and she said, well, it is unusual. Let's see what people think. So they put it in and it won the People's Choice Award. And I
Wow.
was so excited. So that was my first award in making a quilt. So I was straight ahead after that. I started making quilts. I joined a group in Tallahassee, in fact, because they had quilt shows in the museum in Tallahassee. So I joined that group and drove 5 hours to be in a show. And this was another thing I didn't know about because I really didn't know anything about quilting. So I'm learning still a lot about quilting, and I've got all kinds of quilt books now, and I just love looking at the different styles. So when I went to my first big show in Tallahassee, I learned that quilts had to be hung. And I didn't know what that meant to put a sleeve in. So now I drove 5 hours to get there, had two suitcases with two beautiful quilts, and they told me they couldn't show them because they didn't have sleeves. And I almost cried, my eyes filled with water. And a really nice woman offered to put the sleeves on my quilts. And then later she taught me how to put sleeves on. And she didn't know what she was getting into because you had so much fabric to kind of try to go through. And I said, no, you don't have to go through all of that, just the sheet and a little bit of that folded fabric to catch it. And so I learned how to make sleeves. I still don't like having to put a sleeve on a quilt, but by hand, it's tough.
So have you ever seen one of these pine cone quilts with batting in them, or are they always just to a sheet?
No, but this one that I made in the book, I added the sheet and I was going to add batting to it. See, that's a bunch of squares with lots of
Yep.
colors.
With the pine cones in the middle.
Yes, but they're heavy enough. But at least when you make the little squares, they're not as heavy. So no, I haven't seen it with batting in the middle, but I have seen it with the backing on it that covers all the stitches. But Miss Sue told me do not cover the stitches because you want people to see it is handmade and your beautiful handwork because you want your work on the back to be as pretty as the work on the front. So this one, just the way I lined up the points are different. And then
Yeah.
it's the handwork on the back.
Those are pretty big stitches.
They're big on the back, but they're small on the front so that you
Okay.
can't see them.
The stitches on the front, are they not covered by the next row?
Yes, they are. But sometimes people will get their stitches too far up.
That is so beautiful. So, so beautiful.
And you can use all kinds of fabrics. People always say this is a great use of all the scrap fabric you have in your room. So people give me boxes of scrap fabric a lot of times. But if I'm looking for particular colors, then I can't do that. But I want to get back to using just my scraps because it's really more fun. You just cut up all the squares you want, shake them up in a box, stir them up in a box, and just pluck them out and sew. And there you have it.
So this technique is so different from traditional piecing. Do you find that you use color differently?
Yes, I'm limited here because we only have one fabric store. We had two, and then there just aren't that many people. There are a lot of people that quilt, but not enough to support, I guess, two fabric stores. And I found when I go online to buy something, I like it looking at it online, but when I get it, comes in the mail, it's not the texture I want or the color is not exactly as it looked on the computer. So I still love going in the store and picking out colors that I like. Well, this on the border is supposed to glow in the dark. Now I don't have a black light, but one day I'm going to get one and see that it glows in the dark. I don't know. Back here you can see some blues and some reds, and there's a pink one there that I really love. It looks Victorian. And this one I tried to do all flowers.
Well, that leads me to my next question. You teach in France. That reminds me of French general and very French color layouts. How did you get teaching in France?
You asked me, part of my research was to look all over the internet, and I found a lady her name was Leanne. She lived in Seattle, Washington. And I sent a picture to her the same day I sent a picture to the National Quilt Museum. And Leanne wrote back and said, I just learned how to make this design. I don't know much about it, but my friend in France would love to talk to you about this, and she researches quilts all the time. She can probably help you with that. So she introduced me online to Catel in France, and we became fast friends. And the other person that not learned, but was looking at my work at the same time was Rachel Daisy. And Rachel Daisy does beautiful blast of colors, and she started doing them. So Catel did an article in one of the French magazines with me on one page doing my style all by hand, and Rachel doing her style of folded quilts on the sewing machine. And then we also got to meet over the years. So Catel has a blog, and she started writing about me, and the French women wanted to meet me and they wanted a workshop. It was funny because when National Quilt Museum in Paducah, when the lady said, would you like to do a show? And I said, yes. She started writing me and setting up the dates. I said, oh, but I can't do it until I come back from France. So we had to go to France first to do our workshop over there. It was about 100 women, three different
Wow.
workshops we did. And then we had one workshop that had about 100 in one room. Even my husband helped out. And though we don't speak French, Cattell said we all speak patchwork. So you don't have to speak French. It's the hand movement, just fold and sew, and everybody got it. And we had a wonderful, wonderful day. It was just loved it over there. The countryside and the women were just so friendly. I just couldn't get over that. And not speaking any English, it was just incredible. Well, she would translate for us all the time. They gave me presents. Everywhere we went, they fed us. They gave us lots of cheese and food. My husband was loving that part of it. And it was just so nice that they enjoy hand sewing, first of all. So if you go back in history, once again, the French women made a lot of the beautiful gowns for the different queens and the empress. And they did a lot of hand sewing. So hand sewing was right up their alley. I find in America, women really love to use their sewing machine. And the second question that's always asked is, can you show me how to make this on the sewing machine? Well, I haven't done it on the sewing machine, but I know that there are people that have tried. You can't quite make a king size, but you can make a nice size large block.
So are you officially a quilt collector now?
I guess you could say that. My husband would say that. Our stairwell is filled with quilts. Our dining room is filled with quilts. Both bedrooms have 3 or 4 quilts on the bed, and then 2 racks of quilt racks are filled with quilts. And I keep them in dark rooms. keep them covered so I can only expose them when people come over. I'm trying to slow down because at 74, I don't know what I'm going to do with all this stuff, but if I should pass away tomorrow, I have to figure this out. So I really need something else to do. So I'm trying to document them and get as many photographs. That's why I tried to put as many as I could of my vintage quilts in the book, and of course, all of my quilts. There was one on my website that I didn't put in the book because it was my first attempt at putting blocks together with sashing in the middle, and I didn't like it. I showed it on my website. It's called Many Rivers to Cross, but I wasn't pleased with that design. I really like just going around and around and around. And for me, it's like meditating. You just get in the zone. I really have troubles quilting for only 2 hours. When I sit down to quilt, I want to stay there for 3 or 4 hours at a time. But I leave the needle in place so I know where to pick it up again.
How long of a thread do you use, and do you double it?
Mm-mm. Single thread, and I try not. I usually just do like not even arm's length, because if you make it too long, it's knot up on you, and you'll spend most of your time trying to get the knot out after you sew through there. So I just make it maybe 20 inches of thread at a time. Keep my little scissors with me and just cut thread. I use a needle threader now. When I first started, I could just lick my fingers and go like that and get that right through the needle. Now I use a needle threader. Some days I can do it without, just to keep my eyes sharp. I will try it, but I like to sew into the night. So I'm getting pretty good at sewing in the dark. And I think once again of the elderly people back in the day that sewed by candlelight.
Yeah. Well, I often laugh at books when they try to portray this period. They don't realize they did not have those night hours to work that we do because of the lighting.
Well, that, and also they didn't have the luxury to just sit around like that either. You had to work in the fields sometimes or help out. You had children to raise, you had meals to cook. Sometimes you had animals to take care of. So you might have 2 hours to just relax for a moment, sometime to yourself. So by the time your day was finished, it was pretty late. The kids I know helped out a lot, but still, because I used to ask Miss Sue, where did you find all this time to sew? And she told me she didn't start until she was 50 something years old. I mean, she learned early on, but she didn't really start sitting down and spending all this time sewing until later.
So, have you been able to pass on your love of this method to anybody in your family?
No. Well, I only had a brother, so he, of course, didn't know about it then. He passed away at 54, and I wasn't sewing when, well, I was sewing when he passed away, but I don't think it was that big. Let me think. I have some cousins. One recently came to visit me this summer that was interested in just seeing how I made them, but really not doing them herself. I had another cousin that asked me where did I get all this talent from, because no one else in the family was doing any quilting that we knew of. So no, I haven't found anyone in my family, and it's even hard to find young people to pass it on to. When I do workshops, I'm always hoping to find a young person, but most of the people that come are over 60, over 65. Once again, I think young people their lives are so busy that they do not either have the time or taking the time yet to just sit down and do an arts and crafts or to do quilting. A lot of times I've met people whose mother, they say, oh, their mother taught them and they didn't bother to learn. So now they're doing it later on in life. So it's interesting. I don't think it's going to die out, though. It's getting very exciting again. There's a lot of art quilts. There's people that are doing amazing things with quilting now. But I'm still, unfortunately, I'm just such a traditionalist. I still have a flip phone. When people ask me, and even like this internet, all the Zoom stuff, and that's challenging for me because being in the school system and being a school administrator, I always had a secretary or tech support. So I didn't have to do any of this. And now trying to learn it on my own, I don't really want to learn it. I just want somebody to say, okay, put the camera on, I'll talk to you, that kind of thing. And the flip phone, oh, my husband got something the other day in the mail. I said, oh, I'd like to get this. And there was a little barcode, and you had to put your phone on the. He said, we can't do that because we only have flip. I said, well, just you can't have that then because that's all we have. And we're not getting any fancier than that. So I still like my computer. I will spend hours looking at quilts on the computer. And sometimes I actually read a lot of the stories and the history, but I like to see the colors and the designs. I'm fascinated right now with Biza Butler. She does a
Oh, isn't she amazing?
with African prints. And that it's just incredible. I went to the Cummer Museum here. She had an exhibit here in Florida, and they had several quilts. I went to see Harriet Powers' Bible quilt there also,
Mm,
because I wanted to see those quilts up front and personal, right? And of course, you can't touch them, but I almost put my nose to the glass trying to see the stitch work. And I guess that's what quilters do, because when they go to see my quilts, they're always trying to look at the back to see the stitches. And then the ladies come with the white gloves and say, no, no, you can't do that. Let me do that for you. So anyway, I saw Beezer Butler's and Harriet Powers quilt at the museum. And it was just wonderful to see that. And it was 6 hours away from here, even though it was in Florida, because like I said, we're in Central Florida. And I don't drive that far anymore. Getting older, I'm not as comfortable. Our traffic is just so heavy here. I hired a car and took two friends with me, and we were driven to the show and enjoyed it so much. And seeing this amazing quilt, we saw the one with the basketball players all
okay.
over the picture, and it was gigantic. It was bigger than I thought, too, when you see it in the book, or it's even on the cover of one of her books. So that's fascinating. I would like to spend more time going to museums and seeing the quilts on exhibit to see them really up close. I'd like to see a lot more older quilts, and I'm very interested in that whole cloth quilting, where you take the whole sheet, put the batting in there, and just make beautiful designs all over with needlework. Now, I will say, I don't want to get myself into doing that too much. It can ruin your hands. That tight work, that pinching. Most of the women I've seen that do that really are suffering with arthritis and had several surgeries. And they continue to do that kind of work because they love it so much. But my next adventure, I also make dolls. And I love to make stuffed dolls, cloth dolls. My first doll was called Betty Longlegs. So I may go back to that and put some of my quilt work, like have her holding one of my little quilts or something like that. And then I want to make the Pinecone quilt for doll babies, for their cribs, because I saw a show that had maybe 30 little cribs, all the same size. And this woman did little quilts for each crib. So I thought, oh, I could make little sample pine cones. So I've got all these ideas that I want to do, and probably not enough time, but I'm writing them all down.
So you have written a spectacular book here on pinecone quilts. How long did it take you to write?
8 years. No, I it took 8 years to get it published by a publisher. I wrote the book probably in a year, and then I had to keep adding to it, which is why I wound up with all this research because it wasn't enough. The first book was called Miss Sue and the Pinecone Quilt because I wanted it to be just about Miss Sue and I. And then here she is on the back there just playing around. She made her own slips and bras. One day she said, oh, would you like me to make a bra and slip for you? I said, no, thanks. That's okay. But she did make the skirt and she made them all by hand. The first book, I wanted to write more about just Miss Sue and I. And then my editor, publisher at the time said, no, it needs to be more where you're going to teach somebody something also, because that's a different kind of book. And who is your audience going to be? So then it had to grow and grow. They keep taking it back to the drawing board. I had to add more to it each time. And then I was given someone to help me with the writing, and that didn't work out. I couldn't work with because she was trying to change the way I thought, I mean, the way I speak and so forth. So we had to just nix that idea, and I had to keep going along by myself. So I had one editor, Roxanne, that was just wonderful, that she stuck with me from the very beginning because she was the first person that I wrote to. Once again, I want to tell people that whatever you think of, there's somebody out there on the internet that can help you with it. And you can't be afraid to just ask them. All they can do is say no, and you can move on to the next one. So I did that. I wrote to several publishing houses, sent them my first little book. They looked it over. And there's a lot of hoops to jump through nowadays. You don't just put a manuscript on somebody's desk anymore. So they
Mhm.
take it to their group meetings and discuss it. When I met Roxanne, she told me it wasn't for their company at that time, but to try this company, that company. So she recommended others, and I went to those, but I didn't really care for the way they either treated me or what they were looking for and how they wanted me to change. So I kept sending her more pictures and going back to her saying, well, I've done this, I've done. So she made this long list of things for me to do, maybe 25 different items. I did them all. And she told me I was the only person that she had made that many recommendations to who accomplished them all because I really wanted my book to be published. I know you can self-publish, but I just felt it would carry more weight if somebody else published it for me because anybody can self-publish if you have the money. You can put your book out there, but I wanted a publisher. And now I'm happy to say my book is in its second printing. They had to go back.
Wow. Well, congratulations.
Yeah. So I hope it'll be around for a long time and people will enjoy it.
What is your favorite quilt or your currently favorite quilt?
One of my favorites. This will be my second favorite. This one my husband designed, and it's
Oh, the
black.
black and white one with the little bits of red in it.
Yes.
That is a
Called
gorgeous quilt.
Yeah, we call it the Betty and Butler Cuckleboro quilt because he was watching me sew every day and he's sitting in a chair right next to the sofa, looking down, watching me sew. And he said, honey, I'd like for you to make me a quilt. And he said, I'm going to design it. I'm going to pick out all the fabric, but you're going to do the sewing. I said, okay. He picked out all the fabric. And I think it's interesting. Men don't realize how much fabric costs until they're out there. And we started out at the lower end, but the fabrics he liked the best were all at the more expensive fabrics. This is my favorite. This isn't mine. This is, see the design in
Yeah.
the, and I mean, you're going to have to get the book to really see it.
Well, the
But
first Pinecone quilt that I saw, a member of my quilt crew had, and when she would come to our Zoom meetings, she would have it hanging behind her. This is Gladys Birdwell, who also recommended you.
thank you,
And
Gladys.
yeah, thank you, Gladys. This has been very interesting. And she had it, she did by blocks, but they were big blocks. But I
Yes.
just really loved the texture that it brought to the table. It
Hmm.
was so different and so interesting. It just kind of sucks you right into it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And that's why I want to do another one, try again with the blocks, but not with the sashing in the middle, just the blocks themselves. So you can see right here where the seam is together, and then you get this nice triangle look.
So that looks like it's made with smaller pieces. Is that true?
Yes, there are a lot of solid pieces in it.
So when you're making smaller triangles, are you just putting your
Corners
pieces
together.
closest together or using a smaller piece of fabric?
No, when you're doing this style, you take your blocks, no binding on the edge, and then you just put them together corner by corner. And that's what gives you that nice sign like that,
Right.
matching. So you really have to line it up. And you want to use the same colors on the corners, sometimes, not always. This is all polyester. Okay.
How do you label your quilts?
I take a piece of muslin and I usually make a square about this large and just sign my name when I started, when I ended. I put handmade by Betty Ford Smith in Sebring, Florida, the date it was finished. And then I stitched that label on by hand. But Cattell taught me to sign it also in different places. So I also hand sign it. And sometimes I will sign it underneath one of the petals someplace, that kind of thing. In fact, I forgot to mention in that black and white quilt, I have $2 bills in that one. So they're also memory quilts. And I folded up the $2 bills that were given to us when we got married 34 years ago because he was in the military then, and the guys made a money tree for us, and I saved all the $2 bills and never knew what I was going to do with them. So I put them in the quilt. So I've got 20, at least
Wow.
$20 bills. You fold it within the square and then you just sew. So you're not sewing the money. The money is in there, but you can't get it out. And you might be able to feel it if you go all around. But that way I thought we won't sell this quilt. We'll keep it forever like that.
So if people want to get a hold of your book, how do they order it?
You can go to C&T Publishing. You can type in Pinecone Quilts, Keeping Tradition Alive, and You'll have several choices. You can also go to eBay to order it as well.
And if they want to contact you or see
You
more
go
photos of the quilts, how do they get a hold of you?
on my website, pineconequilts.com, and they can email me through that website too. There's a space where you can go to talk to Betty. So they can see all of my quilts. They can see my show at the National Quilt Museum. They can see some of my trip to France is on that website. It's fun to see. Been having a wonderful time with this. I'm just can't believe that I'm a quilter. I thought I was going to paint or dance or do something else, but it's great fun.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing such a wealth of information.
Thank you, Karen, for having me, and I hope I answered all of your questions.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Betty Ford Smith. I can't wait to test out this pinecone technique. If you would like a copy of her book, Pinecone Quilts, Keeping the Tradition Alive, I'll leave a link in the video notes below. I will also leave a link to her website if you need to contact her or you want more information. Next time you're in your sewing room, be sure to have Karen's Quilt Circle playing in the background. I have interviewed so many interesting people on this show. Let one inspire you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.